Hi, I am Mrs. Sloan, and this is a video for my honors biology students. This is our final chapter of the year, environmental concerns, putting it all together. This video is going to be broken down into two parts, all right? First, part one, which you're watching right now, is all about what we're doing to kind of screw things up. And video two, we'll talk about things we can do to fix it. So I'll make myself a little bit smaller. If you are new to my videos, just look down in the descriptor here on YouTube and you will see a link to the group shared notes my students are using for this. Column 1, Mrs. Scaffolding, I'll help you fill it in. Column 2, this is where I encourage students to put pictures in there. My students should be able to give you that script by now, right? Okay, so we're going to start with the notes and environmental concerns. And I think I'm going to need a pointer here. So we have had some great successes in protecting organisms, and we are eventually going to talk about some of those successes. Right now, we're going to talk about kind of what put them in the bad spot to begin with. So human use of resources, and I do want a pointer. Here we go. All right. So we use land, we use water, food, energy, and minerals, and we have both renewable and non-renewable resources. So a resource is anything from and the word you need for your notes, anything from the biotic or abiotic environment that helps humans to meet our needs. Okay, so you just needed to fill in biotic. That would mean living, right? So non-renewable resources, because there's two types, are limited, and these are things like land and fossil fuels and minerals. Renewable resources are not limited in supply. Maybe those are the ones we should use. So not limited in supply, as in solar energy, certain plants and animal species. And then pollution is any change, any alteration of the environment in an undesirable way. So the word you needed there was alteration. So we're changing the conditions on the earth faster than any species can keep up with us. And as a result of that, they're not able to survive. We're creating these extinction conditions. So let's talk about all the resources we're using and why that might cause a problem. So first of all, land use changes. Let's talk about beaches. 70% of the world's beaches are eroding. 70% are eroding away. And here's a map to show you that as well. You can see severely eroded beaches. You'll see more on the East Coast. You know why? It's the storms coming in. All right. And on top of that, we have coastal pollution. And these are toxic substances placed in rivers and eventually get to the coast. Think oil spills. We have issues with semi-arid land, which means it's adjacent to a desert. You have that in the notes. And then desertification, that's not eating too much dessert. I know, I'm tired. It's the conversion of semi-arid land to desert-like conditions, and it often begins with overgrazing, right? Because think about it, overgrazing, you're eating up all the plants that are hanging onto the soil, and then that can change those conditions. And here you can see areas where we're at desertification risk or where it's already occurred as you look across here on these maps. All right, next, tropical rainforests. Yes, we're cutting it down. Great loss of biodiversity, great loss of source of fixing CO2 into oxygen for us. So deforestation is the removal of trees. Deforestation leads to loss of biodiversity and is subject to desertification. Next, here I can show you. 10,000 years ago were the lighter colors in light green and light pink, and then now. So you can see, look right here in Africa, 10,000 years ago, tropical forests, and what's left now, right? Look at those changes. Look at the changes throughout Europe and the United States. So, yes, one more thing we're doing. I know, sort of depressing, right? Abundant water. If you look here, at least when I go around here in California, though we've had limitations occasionally, we just spray water everywhere. We have a lot of plants that require a large amount of water, but there are a lot of areas in this world that don't have access to water. And so here you can see areas that do and do not have access to water. So on drinking water, many people do not have easy access to drinking water. Worldwide, 70% of fresh water is used to irrigate crops. And the sources for that are rivers and lakes. And then if we keep trying to pull water from more and more places, here is just some regions who have a lot of fresh water and those that do not. Using dams, when that happens to kind of back up a river, that has ecological changes to that environment, obviously those downstream, and you can have sediment build up. So dams may not work in the long run because of the buildup of sediment. And then there are aquifers. Again, here speaking for California, like in the Salinas Valley, kind of in the middle of California, which is like the salad bar of vegetable growing. We're just pulling so much water out of aquifers that eventually you can get sinkholes. This wasn't in California though. Aquifers, water getting removed at a rate that can't be sustained, hence sinkholes. And on top of that, when you remove the fresh water, then that gets filled in by other neighboring bodies of water, and that brings in salt water, which can destroy crops. So, and saltwater intrusion. All right, food, we need it. And our food primarily comes from growing crops, from animals, and fish. I know fish are an animal. Okay, so on your notes, growing crops, animals, and fishing. We have several harmful practices, poor farming practices. Those include planting only a few genetic varieties, so limited in the biodiversity of what we plant. Heavy use of fertilizers, pesticides, and herbicides, over irrigation, and excessive fuel consumption. When you think about how to, when we pick a crop and the process there and the packaging, the plastic to ship it a long ways away, and the idea would maybe we could eat locally, and so we don't have all those packaging, right? So that would, I'm just planting that in your head there. So next, let's talk about soil loss. I'll move myself over here. So it's at an alarming rate here in the United States and Canada. And this, if you look at this map on very degraded soil, stable soil without vegetation, look at all of the very degraded and degraded soil. That's a pretty big deal, right? Because we need that soil, right, to in our traditional farming practices, and maybe we need to explore some other ways of farming, right? In our traditional farming practices, we need that soil. So then that leads to salinization. Salinization is increased salts due to evaporation of excess irrigation water. 25 to 35% of U.S. croplands are suffering from salinization. Next, the Green Revolution. So the Green Revolution, just speaking of farming practices, at first, the big deal was making high responder plants, which are high yield plants, but require high levels of fertilizer, water, and pesticides to produce their high yield. Now, the second revolution is looking at genetically engineered crops. So that's the word you need there, genetically engineered crops and their advances. But there could be people that are in opposition to that genetic engineering of those crops that maybe need less water or can be given salt water instead of fresh water. Okay, domestic livestock. Still, we're underneath the umbrella of food, right? Domestic livestock, most of the grain grown today is not given to people to eat, but it's actually given to domesticated animals. So most of the grain grown is used to feed domesticated animals in MDCs, more developed countries. And the livestock care is very energy intensive in MDCs, as well as contributing to pollution. So if you remember from our biogeochemical cycles, when we talked about runoffs from dairy farms, et cetera, and getting into bodies of water and causing eutrophication. And the hits keep coming. Fishing, all right? Modern fishing methods have decimated fisheries. And the problem is if the numbers get too low, then you reach this extinction vortex because there isn't enough variety of genes, and also they're more susceptible to genetic drift, if you remember from Hardy Weinberg, and they're so far apart that they can't mate. There's just numbers aren't high enough that would give you good viability in mating. All right. And next, let's talk about energy. So we use a lot of non-renewable energy sources. Non-renewable, what does that mean? It can run out. So what happens, right? Do we prepare for that? Do we think maybe, look at all this pollution these kinds of sources are causing? What are their impacts? Should we maybe explore some others, right? So non-renewable energy sources, fossil fuels, it is the source of 75% of the world's energy, 75%. As they burn, there are environmental consequences. It's a connection to global warming through the production of greenhouse gases, as well as pollution, Okay, here is a coal train rumbling across Montana, and it is a half a mile long, this coal train, and it carries barely a day's fuel for a large power plant. The U.S. burns more than 1 billion tons of coal a year. Is there another option? Maybe nuclear power. People, though, are concerned with meltdowns that can come with those radioactive wastes. So maybe we need to look at, just an idea, renewable energy sources, right? The types: hydropower, geothermal, wind, and solar energy, So we could have a possible solar hydrogen revolution. Solar energy would replace fossil fuels and hydrogen fuel instead of gasoline. It could solve a lot of problems. It solves our family's problem. When we went solar and with a purely electric car, it dropped the cost tremendously of the electricity that we were using. And also, we're glad that we're not burning carbon in order to transport ourselves around. Yes, we could talk about the batteries that are in them, but I'm open to that. Okay, mineral search. They are minerals. We use a lot of minerals. They are used up quickly, and the mining process threatens ecosystem. It's like scraping the skin off your body. That's what you do when you scrape the soil surface off the earth, right? So the mining threatens ecosystems. It creates waste and pollution. What else right here. Sorry. Stripping surfaces, which is what's happening here in open cast mining. Again, back to all the resources we are using. Stripping surface layers from the Earth's crust to obtain coal, ore, and other valuable minerals. The dragline excavators strip away surface layers, and mechanical shovels distribute the minerals and spoil. The minerals are carried away for grading and processing. In some countries, they have to repair or try to repair what they have done once they're done. Okay, then what else are we doing? Well, we have production of synthetic organic compounds. So what I want you to see right here is this is what we're trying to get. A nice bottle of water on the go, right? A disposable throwaway water bottle. Look what has to happen in order for you to use one of those instead of a refillable container, right? You have to get the oil from an oil rig, oil well, pipeline, a chemical plant, which makes these nurdles, which get put on a cargo ship. You need a water source and a port. You need to transport those. You go to a boiling plant, a bottler, to fill them with water, another truck, a big box store where you buy it, and then you create trash, and then you need a garbage truck to pick up your trash, and then it's in a dump for 700 years. Just for your convenience of being able to grab a bottle water instead of just refilling a container. So synthetic organic compounds or modified organic compounds are detrimental effects on the health of living things. It's involved in the production of plastics, pesticides, and herbicides. And then CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons. This is a halogenated hydrocarbon. Chlorine and fluorine atoms replace some of the hydrogen atoms, and it's involved in the ozone destruction. So maybe not a good idea. And then we generate a tremendous amount of waste. Agricultural waste. When it says endocrine disrupting contaminants, some of the agricultural waste and even some of the plastic manufacturing does this as well. It can make something that mimics a hormone. So salmon are not able to osmoregulate and go between salt water and fresh water. We create a lot of sewage that we use a lot of chemical treatment on, and a lot of industrial waste. So generated during mining and manufacturing on the waste, and agricultural. Some are endocrine disrupting contaminants. So what does this cause, right? So let's talk about all of what we just discussed and its impact on biodiversity. So first of all, we're going with the premise that biodiversity positively influences ecosystems, having a great degree of variety of species, a variety of landscapes, a variety of communities. That's what we're talking about when we talk about biodiversity. So it's all the variety of life on Earth. And take just a quick minute. Look at how many of those are insects, right? And here's plants and here's animals. So those are the species that we're talking about. And what here, if a species is indicated to be threatened, it's in danger of becoming endangered. And if you're endangered, you're in danger of immediate extinction. So it goes threatened, endangered, and then extinction. You might want to add that to your notes. So what causes that? Well, causes of extinction. Okay, here is a list of them. Number one on there is habitat loss, then exotic species, pollution, overexploitation, and disease. So we're assuming that ecosystems that are stable perform a high degree, with a high degree of biodiversity, they perform for us, right? And so when we decrease the biodiversity, decreasing their functionality, that's not good, right? So what decreases biodiversity? Extinction. Now, if you look over here and you look at habitat loss and exotic species and pollution, if you add those all up, that'd be more than 100%, right? So what this is saying is that you could have a species become extinct and habitat loss and pollution could have both been a part of it, all right? So, but what's a part of most extinctions? Habitat loss, all right? So on your notes, it is involved in 85% of all cases of extinction. It could be habitat loss coupled with disease, but habitat loss is involved in 85% of all extinctions. So the rainforests, well, rainforests have been reduced from original 14% of total land mass down to 6% of our land mass. And keep in mind that it is estimated that half of all the species on Earth live in the tropical rainforest. Half of all species. And we have reduced it from 14% down to 6%. Then on top of that, we have coastal degradation. Coastal degradation is due to high human populations that live along the shore. Already, 60% of coral reefs are destroyed or near destruction. 60% of all the coral reefs, as well as mangrove forests, wetlands, estuaries, and seagrass beds. All right, so number one involved in most is habitat loss. Number two are alien or exotic species. So this is a problem down in Florida. So a few pet pythons got released. They did not evolve in Florida, and so they have no natural competition, no natural predators, so they're just running amok, and they become huge, 20 feet long, weigh up to 250 pounds, eating anything, deer, bobcats, other endangered species. A decade ago, there were only a few. Now there's well over 100,000. So on your exotic species, they are involved in nearly 50% of all cases of extinction. So it's defined as an alien species or exotics that are introduced accidentally or deliberately into ecosystems. Natural ecosystems have evolved with their native organisms in balance. Exotic species may have no natural predator. They outcompete, this is in your notes, predator, outcompete native species, or become a predator of threatened species, or become a predator of threatened species. So how did they get there? Well, some barriers were broken. So barriers is migration out of ecosystems is blocked normally by these barriers, like maybe huge bodies of water. However, humans circumvent these barriers by various means. One is colonization, so pioneers bring them. Horticulture and agriculture. Horticulture is like decorative plants, agriculture is for farming. And then C is accidental transport, accidental transport. So what happens? Well, one example This was kudzu, a vine from Japan. It was brought in to help deal with soil erosion that was caused by man, right? So we removed plants. We started to get erosion along freeways. So let's bring in this kudzu. It didn't evolve here. Now it has taken over and it's out competing native plants in that area. So it's changing the ecosystems in which other species live as well. So all of these alien species, they can disrupt a habitat, right? One species, we've already looked at this at food chains and food webs. And so we know that if you take out a key species, right, that can cause a disruption of the entire ecosystem, of the entire food web. And here is an example of that. In Montana, they were trying to increase the amount of salmon, primarily for people to eat, right? So they said, what do the salmon eat? Oh, they eat this. They can eat this opossum shrimp. So let's bring that in. So opossum shrimps were introduced into, they're non-natives, introduced into these Montana lakes, but instead the shrimp competed with the salmon for this zooplankton. As a result, the salmon didn't get enough to eat. Their numbers plummeted. And then those organisms that depended on the salmon, like the eagle and the grizzly bear, then their numbers plummeted. So we need to not be naive when we just introduce some non-native species. So food webs, alien species disrupt food webs. For example, when the shrimp introduced to Montana, and you have all that in your notes. Just looking at the time. Okay, next, islands. Islands are more susceptible. They have a very narrow range of what they can tolerate. And an example of where we massively screwed up there is that we, through shipping, brought in rats to Hawaii, a non-native species, which is then running amok in Hawaii. So then they're like, oh, in other places, who eats rats? Oh, mongooses eat rats. Let's bring in mongooses to eat the rats. But here was the problem. The birds in Hawaii did not have a predator that forced them to put their nests into trees. They had no natural predator that would harm their nests, and all of their nests tend to be on the ground. Well, when the mongooses come in, you have a choice between eggs and chicken and a rat. They were all eating the endemic and native species to Hawaii, the birds and their eggs, and then made that species. So we still have the rats, and now we don't have the native birds. So islands are especially susceptible to disruption by the introduction of exotics. And then the example I gave you right there about the mongooses, that's in your notes. Okay, what else? Pollution. Okay, so pollution is involved in 24%, and then that can lead to disease. And disease is involved in about 3%, but pollution and disease are often tied together. So involved in 24% and can lead to disease. And pollution is any environmental change that adversely affects the lives and health of living things. So let's run through 5 major causes of pollution. Just keeps getting better. Okay, acid rain, automobile exhaust and sulfur dioxide from power plants combined with water vapor cause acid rain. It can cause trees to weaken, kills small invertebrates, and decomposers, and kills the life in lakes. All bad. Think about the role of decomposers, right? They're taking dead material and decomposing it down so it's accessible by plants again, right? And we're wiping those out. Okay, so that's pollution number 1. Pollution number 2 is eutrophication. Eutrophication is when lakes are stressed by excess nutrients from sewage treatment and agricultural runoff. Lakes are stressed by excess nutrients from sewage treatment and agricultural runoff. So what happens? You have a limiting factor. Let's say it would be phosphates in fresh water, nitrogen in saline or brackish water, salt or brackish water, and you have this limiting nutrient. And all of a sudden now, because of runoff, let's say from a dairy farm, you have all these phosphates. Now the algae are no longer limited and they have an algal bloom. Well, it cannot be sustained. That algae eventually dies. And who works on dead algae? Decomposers. So decomposers do cellular respiration. What do they require? Oxygen. So the decomposers that work on all this dead algae take all the oxygen out of the lake and cause death of the lake and massive fish kill. So on your notes for eutrophication, algae grow in abundance, die off, bacterial decomposers then use up all the oxygen and it kills the fish. All right, let's look about more pollution. Ozone depletion. So the ozone shield protects us, right? It protects our skin, it protects our immune system, and the result of the shield breakdown, depression of the human immune system, impaired crop and tree growth, and I know death of plankton. So plankton, there's phytoplankton and zooplankton. Phytoplankton are at the bottom of the food chain in many aquatic ecosystems. So that's bad. All right, then we have all these organic chemicals, nonylphenols used in plastics. I kind of mentioned this a little bit before, spermicides in cosmetics. They mimic effects of hormones, so they're endocrine disruptors. So on organic chemicals, a wide variety of chemicals are produced and enter the environment. They mimic the effects of hormones. All right, and yet more. All right, and then global warming, which I know you have discussed many times over all of your science courses, but the basics, I want to remind you, it refers to the expected increase in the average temperatures in the 21st century due to greenhouse gases. Okay, this is not, do you believe in global warming? It is, do you understand global warming? Yes? So data collected worldwide show a rise in greenhouse gases, and the global climate appears to have risen since the Industrial Revolution. The results, as the ocean warms, glaciers will melt and sea levels will rise. Regions of suitable climate for species would shift rapidly and probably faster than plants could migrate, and then the animals who need those plants, right? So when you think about it, we have more fires and more floods. You're going to have more extreme weather as a result of global warming. Okay, and yet there is more. So you're in your mind, number one cause of extinction is habitat loss. It's involved in 85%. Number two is exotic species, involved in 50% of all extinctions. Number three, we went through a plethora of pollution. That's involved in 24% of all extinctions. And now overexploitation is number four, and it's involved in 17% of the cases of extinction, 17%. So looking at a few organisms that were exploited and causing massive extinction. And it is defined as exploitation occurs when removal of the individuals from the wild population drastically reduces their numbers, And then what happens is this positive feedback in a bad way is as, let's say this is a fish that people want in their fish tanks, right? So he's collecting them. Put a pin in that. I'll talk to you about how he's collecting them, but he's collecting them, okay? And now there are fewer of them. They are harder to get. So what happens is people want them even more because they become even more special because they are more rare. Do you remember when we talked about the bowerbird and how one of them, he likes to collect blue things in order to attract a mate? Sadly, many of us try to collect things that are rare to make us feel good about ourselves. So you might consider that because this positive feedback loop is driving this extinction vortex. Now, what I told you to put a pin in is how he gets these fish. What he'll do is he'll spray the water with cyanide, which stuns the fish so they're easier for him to pick up and grab. But what that does is it destroys the coral reef, which the fish need to live. So any fish that are remaining behind probably don't have a good habitat to live in anymore. So now there will be even fewer. So feedback, rarity causes a positive feedback cycle. The fewer the specimens left, the more valuable they are. And examples of those are cacti to gardeners and parakeets, and macaws are sold to pet stores, tropical fish, etc. Okay, and then when we look at fish stocks, and this is back to the way in which we fish, fish stocks are being depleted by overfishing, and huge trawling nets capture bottom-dwelling fish. This has been called the marine equivalent to clear cutting trees. Just like we wipe down trees in the tropical rainforest, when you drag these nets across the ocean floor, it completely disrupts the ecosystem. And then on top of that, another fishing method is called purse seine fishing. So it's like a purse that you're pulling up, and they pull up everything. Things they're not supposed to pull up, things that are okay to pull up. But once they've been brought from the deep up, you've disrupted their swim bladders poking out their mouth, and then they just throw them out and they end up dying, right? And in the process of that, they have a lot of incidental mortality and a lot of habitat modification. So purse seine fishing surrounds tuna, big nets drawn up like strings of a purse. And last but not least, the fifth cause of extinctions are disease. So disease is involved in 3% of all extinctions due to an encroachment of humans on their habitat. Wildlife has been exposed to new pathogens from domestic animals. All right, that is it for video 1. In video 2, we're going to talk about some more uplifting things. We're going to talk about the value of biodiversity and ways to sustain it. So if you are one of my students, I'll see you in class.